Thank you, Professor Ohayon. Thank you. I wanted to thank Shimon Ohayon and to all of the people who organized this conference. And as for it was actually good to speak before dinner so that I could work up an appetite. So, thank you. The first Jews to set foot on the North American continent were Sephardi conversos, who came as part of the invading force led by the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés in 1521. A number of them, it seems, were crypto-Jews, and one of them, Hernando Alonso, was burned at the stake at the first auto da fe in Mexico City in 1528. And despite a requirement for newcomers to have a certificate of limpieza de sangre, Mexico, like other provinces in New Spain, continued to attract Marranos. They came in such considerable numbers that it was said by the mid-16th century, people complaining, there were more crypto-Jews than Catholics in Mexico City, and that they even had an anonymous grand rabbi, which of course is highly unlikely, and an independent tribunal of the Holy Office of the Inquisition was established in 1571, from which time on, investigations, persecutions of suspected Judaizers increased substantially. Among the victims were members of the distinguished Carvajal family, including Luis de Carvajal El Modo, the nephew of the governor of Mexico, along with his mother and his sisters, all of whom were burned at the stake between 1596 and 1649. And his saga and that of his family inspired a host of historical and literary works, including a play by the great French librettist and playwright Prosper Mérimée, La Famille de Carvajal. One or two individual Sfaradim came to the colonies of Virginia and Massachusetts in the first half of the 17th century. One of them was from Bordeaux, and he was brought in to teach them viticulture. They wanted to try to make wine, which obviously didn't succeed. But with the arrival in New Amsterdam in 1654 of 23 mostly Sephardi Jews who were fleeing Recife in Brazil after the Portuguese takeover, the first openly practicing Jewish community in North America was soon established. And for more than a century thereafter, the Spanish-Portuguese minhag became the exclusive rite in the major Jewish population centers of New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, Savannah, Newport, and then finally here in Montreal. Even though after 1720, Ashkenazim from Central Europe became the majority Jewish population. No Jews at all, Sfaradim or Ashkenazim, seem to have been in Canada during the period of French colonial rule, when Jews and Huguenots were specifically barred from New France. In spite of this ban, it was the great Sephardi family, the Gradis family of shipping magnates in Bordeaux, that played a major role in trade and transit between the motherland and the colony. And despite heavy losses to its fleet, it was the Société Gradis et Fils that maintained a lifeline to New France during the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. There's no evidence, however, that any member of the Gradis family ever even visited Canada. And Jewish settlement really only began, there were one or two individuals who did come into Canada, but that Jewish settlement only began with British rule. Although the original Jewish settlers in British Canada, among them the Harts, the Josephs, the Judahs, were all Ashkenazim, the first congregation that they established here in Montreal in 1768 followed the Sephardi minhag. Since many of them came to Canada from the 13 colonies, this was the rite with which they were familiar, and they even named their congregation She'erith Israel, or growing up in New York, we always called the congregation She'erith Israel, the same name as that of the Spanish-Portuguese Synagogue of New York, and in a sense, they thus became Sfaradim by association. This group of Sephardi Ashkenazim, if you will, evolved into a Jewish elite which not only comprised the Montreal equivalent of New York's grandees and our crowd, to use the title of Stephen Birmingham's popular books about the Sephardi and German Jewish elites in the United States, but they actually were, in a real sense, an amalgamation of the two. The few Sephardim who came into Canada in this early period were either transient and came on business from the 13 colonies or from the Caribbean, which had the largest, actually, Jewish population in the New World and was heavily Sephardi, or they married local Christian women and never joined the Jewish community. But in spite of the paucity of ethnic Sephardim, the Sephardi ritual foundations of She'arith Israel in Montreal continued to be cultivated and strengthened throughout much of the 19th century by its longtime successive spiritual leaders who were indeed of Sephardi ancestry. The most prominent of these was Abraham de Sola, who came from London in 1847 and was succeeded by his son, the first Canadian-born rabbi, minister, but for our purposes, rabbi, Aaron David Meldola de Sola, who, upon his death in 1882, he in turn led the congregation until his death in 1918. And by the way, Aaron's brother, Clarence Isaac, became the founder and longtime leader of Canadian Zionism. Only a very few Jews whose origins lay in the Islamic world came to North America during this early period. Two, however, stand out: Judah Monis in the 18th century and David Levi Yulee in the 19th. Monis was born in Algiers and was educated in Livorno and Amsterdam. He came to New York in 1715 and was a merchant there, but he also, on the side, you know the famous story, if I were Rothschild, I'd be richer than Rothschild. And they say, how? Because I would teach a little Hebrew on the side. He taught Hebrew to Jews and Christians in New York. And in 1720, he moved to Cambridge and wrote a letter to the Harvard Corporation offering his services as a teacher of Hebrew. He was granted a Master's of Arts degree in Hebrew by Harvard, the first Jew to receive a university diploma in North America. And he became instructor of Hebrew at Harvard in 1722, shortly after his conversion to Christianity. He published the first, the degree also was right after he converted. He published the first book of Hebrew grammar in America, entitled Dikduk Lashon Gnibrit, the Spanish-Portuguese Gnayin. And he also published several pamphlets, mostly apologia for his new faith, and he taught on the Harvard faculty for 39 years. Yulee was born in the West Indies to a Moroccan father in 1810, but he grew up in Florida. His father was a sugar planter. He was none other than the grandson of Eliyahu Halevi ibn Yulee, the powerful court Jew of the Moroccan Sultan Sidi Muhammad bin Abdullah, who was immortalized, not very flatteringly, in the Hebrew travelogue classic, a biting portrait by Samuel Romanelli. This travelogue is entitled Masa Ba'arav, which we translated into English a number of years ago as, with this trying to catch the play in Hebrew, travail in an Arab land. And like his grandfather, Yulee went into government service and became the first senator for the new state of Florida in 1845. Known as the Florida Fire Eater for his passionate pro-slavery Jews, even though, by the way, his father was an abolitionist, he was a supporter of the Southern cause and served in the Confederate Congress during the Civil War. Another prominent Sephardi, though not with roots in the Islamic world, who served in the antebellum U.S. Senate, representing Louisiana, and had held at different times the positions of Secretary of War, Secretary of State, and Attorney General for the Confederacy was Judah P. Benjamin. His parents were Western Sfaradim from England. He was a close confidant of Benjamin Davis, the president of the Confederacy, and has been referred to, in fact, in that day, as the brains of the Confederacy. He was without a doubt the best-known Jew in North America in his day. And because of his eloquent defense of the institution of slavery in a Senate debate, he was dubbed at the time an Israelite with Egyptian principles. And the poet Stephen Vincent Benet, whom I must say I only discovered this recently, I always loved Benet, but he immortalized him as a sinister figure in his poem, John Brown's Body. We only read pieces of it in school, not the anti-Jewish parts. And there he writes, Judah P. Benjamin, the dapper Jew, seal sleek, black-eyed, lawyer and epicure. The mind behind the silk-ribbed fan was a dark prince, clothed in an Eastern stuff. Unlike Yulee, who remained in the United States after the Civil War, received a pardon, and became an important railroad developer in Florida, and got a second nickname as the father of Florida railroads, Benjamin fled to England, where he had a very successful legal career and was appointed Queen's Counsel. And by the way, he's buried in Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. The influx of Jews from Germanic lands in the first half of the 19th century and the mass immigration of Jews from Eastern Europe that began around 1880 made North American Jewry overwhelmingly an Ashkenazi community. However, beginning in the last decade of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th, at the height of this period of mass immigration into the US, Sfaradim from Islamic lands, particularly from Ottoman Turkey, the Balkans, Greece, and Syria, began to arrive in significant numbers, and by the time immigration was closed off in 1924, the number of Sephardi Mizrahi, I use the shorthand, for politically correct reasons, we no longer say Oriental Jews. The Sephardi Mizrahi Jews in the United States had grown to between 50 and 60,000, of whom 40,000 settled in New York City. And although dwarfed by the Ashkenazi population, which by this time numbered over 4 million in the US and over 125,000 here in Canada, these Sephardi communities maintained a strong ethnic identity and a lively cultural life, with Ladino weekly newspapers, starting with La America, which appeared between 1910 and 1924, and La Vara, the most successful Ladino publication of all, which ran from 1921 all the way up to 1948. These papers played a similar role in the Sephardi immigrant community, with both news and advice columns as their forwards and their tug among Yiddish-speaking Ashkenazim. For example, writing under the pseudonym of Tia Satula, Aunt Satula, or also as Bula Satula, the Salonican-born Moise Sulam had an advice column for women that appeared intermittently in all of the leading Ladino newspapers for more than 2 decades, and was reminiscent of Abraham Kahan's famous Bintelbrief in their forwards. With the notable exception of Syrian Jews, many of the second and third generations of these early 20th century Sephardim assimilated into the broader American Jewish community. That is, they married Ashkenazim and then joined movements like the Reform movement, the Conservative movement, and so on, and they lost much of their distinctive identity. The Syrian Jews, by contrast, most of whom were Halabis, that is Aleppans, but also Shamis, Damascenes, after initially living on Manhattan's Lower East Side, primarily settled in Brooklyn. They formed what the anthropologist, the late anthropologist, Walter Zenner, rightly called one of the most cohesive Jewish communities outside of Hasidim in the diaspora. And indeed, they constituted, again in Zenner's terminology, a global community bound by ties of business and family, often the two were intertwined, and a very self-conscious adherence to their religious and ethnic traditions, which included strict oversight and discipline in communal education and social life, and endogamy within the group. The adherence to tradition is especially noticeable in their distinctive liturgical music and cuisine. And I remember years ago I was a guest of the Syrian community in Brooklyn, and hearing young people, for example, singing at the synagogue, and actually it was Hanukkah. There was a Hanukkah festival at the Jewish Community Center, and this is now 5th generation in some cases in the U.S., and they sounded just like they had come just out of Halab or out of Damascus. One of the best reflections of the tight-knit social life is the New Jersey beach resort town of Deal, where many Syrians took and still take summer vacations, and has become a veritable colony of the Brooklyn community. The communal discipline with regard to endogamous marriage was further strengthened by a rabbinical proclamation in 1935, signed by Chief Rabbi Chaim Tawil and co-signed by 4 other leading rabbis, forbidding conversion for the purpose of marriage. And the ban followed the initiative of the Syrian community of Buenos Aires and has been accepted by other parts of the Syrian diaspora. A subsequent decree issued in 1946 forbade marriage with converts and banned such couples from synagogue life and even burial in the communal cemetery. And both declarations were reiterated in a document issued by all the rabbis of the Syrian congregations and yeshivot, as well as leaders of the community organizations in 1984. And at least to the best of my knowledge, no other Jewish community, Sephardi or Ashkenazi, has ever issued such a completely comprehensive ban. Encouraging girls to marry young, late teens or early 20s, also contributed to endogamy within the community. Until the 1960s, only a small number of Syrian Jewish men and women attended college, and women did not go in considerable numbers until the 1980s. And most of these went to Brooklyn College or to Thoreau College's Brooklyn branch campus, and thus remained in the community. And even for boys to go outside. I taught for 23 years in Binghamton in upstate New York, and our basketball star was Mo Salame. And Mo told us he was told when he went, he could go out of town to college, he could date Jewish girls from different communities, but he was going to return and marry a Syrian girl. And even those women that did go to college did not always finish, but left to get married before graduation, many of them. They also tended to marry men who were somewhat older and were already working and were ready to start families. Now, new waves of Sephardi Mizrahi Jews began coming to North America in the second half of the 20th century in the wake of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the dissolution of colonialism. New York and Los Angeles in the US, Montreal and Toronto here in Canada, became the major centers of settlement for these newcomers. And these are today vibrant communities, ethnically, religiously, culturally, and economically. And I must say, I spent Shabbat in a Moroccan neighborhood here in Canada, went to a Moroccan synagogue, and you could feel how lively it is. In the States, where the Sephardi Mizrahi population now numbers between 250,000 and 300,000, these communities are highly diverse and include, for example, the so-called New Syrians, that is, Jews from Egypt, Lebanon, South America of Syrian ancestry, Moroccans, and a large Iranian and Central Asian Jewish community that came in the 1970s and 1980s following the Islamic Revolution in Iran and the breakup of the Soviet Union. In Los Angeles, because of its large and very visible Iranian community, which includes, in addition to more than 30,000 Jews, perhaps 500,000 Iranian Muslims, it's often called nowadays in the US, jokingly, Teherangeles. And a second major community of some 10,000 Jews has settled in and around Great Neck, Long Island. Although the majority of the Iranian Jewish community has only been in the U.S. For 2 generations, and there have been adaptations to American Jewish life, it's made a concerted effort to maintain defining aspects of its ethnic and religious identity and also its cultural values. Schools, for example, especially in California, have added classes in Farsi and Iranian Jewish history and traditions. Bilingual publications include articles aimed at young people, and there are a host of cultural centers, such as the Nesa Educational Cultural Center, founded by Rabbi David Shofet in Los Angeles, the Center for Iranian Jewish Oral History, founded by Human Sarshar, and the Iranian American Jewish Federation functions within the broader American Jewish Federation network. And as with the Syrian community, there are ethnic markets for food, there are restaurants, specialty shops, bookstores, all of which contribute to the preservation of community daily life. There are also a fair number of Iranian Jewish academics in American institutions of higher learning. I mentioned Human Sarshar, Haideh Sahim, Jaleh Pirnazar, Dalia Yarshapur, and Daniel Tzaddik, to mention but a few, who teach and write about the Persian Jewish heritage in both scholarly publications and in those aimed at a more general reading public. Additionally, there are a number of Iranian-born Jewish literary figures, such as Dalia Sofer and Farida Dayanim Goldin, who have reached an even wider audience with their novels, their memoirs, short stories, and appearances on American National Public Radio, NPR. And there are also award-winning filmmakers as well. Not as fiercely insular as the Syrian Jews, the Iranian Jews have a greater complexity of relationships with the Muslims from their country of origin, who live in large numbers in Los Angeles and the New York metropolitan areas. Still in all, there are certain boundaries, and as the social historian and ethnographer Leah Baer said to me, and she's researched this community in America, she has found that still, quote, for the most part, the parameters established in Iran have lingered in much the same, for much of the same reasons as with the Syrian community, though not as intense. Another distinct group historically related to the Iranian Jewry that came to the U.S. at the same period are the Bukharan Jews. They settled mainly in the New York metropolitan area, particularly in Queens, where by 1987 they numbered about 5,000, and we believe that number has quadrupled since then. Smaller enclaves exist in California, Arizona, South Florida, Colorado, and there are about 500 in Canada, divided between Toronto and Montreal. They too have built a network of ethnic, cultural, and religious organizations. However, their smaller numbers, their more modest economic profile, and the lack of a sizable, highly educated and articulate elite comparable to that of the Iranian Jewish community makes for a far less visible group on the American Jewish scene. Furthermore, the community has in recent years been plagued by internal divisions, which reached a crisis point when the Ashkenazi Bet Din of Queens, at the request of some factions within the Bukharan community, ruled that the longtime chief rabbi, Yitzhak Yehoshua, should be dismissed from his post for laxity in conversion and kashrut standards. One of the factions opposing him consisted of younger rabbis from the community who were educated in Ashkenazi yeshivot and wanted the Bukharan rabbinate to move in a more stringent Ashkenazi-style Orthodox direction, something which I called in a little book which I wrote called Sephardi Religious Responses to Modernity, Ashkenazification among Sephardim. Some 15,000 Moroccan Jews came to the US in this wave, and it's the fourth largest Moroccan diaspora community diaspora in the sense of not being in Morocco. Israel, France, Canada, and then the US. Many of them didn't immigrate directly into the US from Morocco, but from France, from Israel, and elsewhere. Los Angeles is also their population center with about 7,000, and New York a close second with 5,000, and there's a large community in Washington, D.C. and South Florida. Many of the Moroccan Jews attend multi-ethnic Sephardi synagogues and identify as Sephardim first and foremost, especially in the second and third generations. In some cases, there are multiple congregations under a single roof, what's come to be called in America a synaplex, S-Y-N. In Los Angeles, however, there are several specifically Moroccan congregations and a big community center attached to the Em Habanim Sephardic congregation in North Hollywood, which has over 500 family members and is a bastion of the Moroccan tradition, and its rabbi and cantor is the famous Chaim Luke, who is the renowned interpreter of Andalusian musical tradition and performs regularly at music festivals all over the world, including in Morocco. The Moroccan Jews who immigrated to the United States often had education, business experience, and in some cases funds, and a few of them reached the very highest echelons of the American business world. And the latter would include men like the billionaire Mark Lasry, the founder of Avenue Capital, the world's most profitable hedge fund today, the real estate magnate Joseph Chetrit in New York, another billionaire, Paul Ben Sabat and Alain Banquier, the founders of Saveur Food Groups, and who, by the way, are the co-CEOs of the largest kosher food company, which makes mainly Ashkenazi kosher food, Manischewitz. And a few years ago, in the front page of the Lucette Lanyado, who is from Egypt, wrote an article that they tasted gefilte fish, found it tasteless, and wanted to make Moroccan Quarry del Herz, boulette de poisson. And they went to the chief cook for Manischewitz, and they said, well, they gave him a recipe with cumin, and so on, and he didn't know what it was. And as far as I know, they haven't made it yet. And of course, there's Paul and Maurice Marciano, the founders of Guess Jeans in Los Angeles. Now, while the study of the Moroccan Jewish heritage has attracted a number of American academics, they come overwhelmingly from the general Jewish, that is Ashkenazi population. The great majority of Moroccan Jewish academics are to be found in France, in Israel, and here in Canada. The Moroccan Jews who came to the US were mostly practically oriented, with just one or two exceptions, which for time I'm going to skip. In Canada, to conclude, the new communities are more homogeneous, and the overwhelming majority, as you know, 70% are of Moroccan origin. And 2/3 of the entire Sephardi population is here in Montreal alone, where, as Michael Elbaz has noted, they were attracted by, quote, a social space that was simultaneously American, Francophone, and multicultural. Despite the majority Moroccan component, the organized community here has opted for an overall pan-Sephardi identity under the umbrella of the Communauté Séfarade Unifiée de Québec, and has for more than 4 decades presented the Semaine Séfarade, which evolved because of its importance into the Quinzaine Séfarade, and since 2006 is the Festival Séfarade. And I had the honor many, many years ago, actually twice, being invited to speak at the Semaine Séfarade. As my colleague, the historian, and one of the organizers of this conference, Yolande Cohen, who has conducted extensive research on this community, has noted, this identity reconstruction on the part of Sephardi immigrants based upon a more romanticized distant past, that is the golden age of Spain, rather than a recent one, Morocco, has facilitated their integration into both the Jewish and the broader Quebecois communities. She also observed that this strategy differs from that of the much smaller immigrant community in Toronto and from that in Israel, I might add, where either the ethnicity of the more immediate past is emphasized or there is more identification with the dominant general culture. And for example, the sociologist Sarah Taib Carlin, who did research on the Toronto community, found as far back as the 1980s that 60% of the Sephardi community in Toronto, none of whom had spoken English at home in their countries of origin, listed English as the home language in Canada in the first generation. Immigrants from Islamic countries who came to Montreal, also, whether they were Moroccan or not, were bound together by a common education, very often in the schools of the Alliance Israélite Universelle or the French Mission Culturelle, and these include Naim Katan from Iraq, Victor Teboul from Egypt, and Serge Waknin from Morocco, and they provided serious literary leavening to the cultural life, both Jewish and general. So too did numerous academics who joined the faculty of Canadian universities and are indeed among the participants and organizers of this conference. They also kept alive the musical traditions, as did the great master of Andalusian song, Sami al-Maghribi, who was here, although certainly far smaller numerically than their counterparts across the border in the United States. The artistic and intellectual cadre of Sephardi Mizrahi immigrants in Canada, particularly here in Montreal, has had, I would posit, a more profound cultural impact upon their Jewish and their surrounding Gentile communities. And this is due in part to the fact they are more geographically concentrated and among a smaller general Jewish and non-Jewish population. And in the case of Montreal, they came with a formation française at the time of Québécois national revival, which facilitated their acceptance and their integration. Now, migrations have been a part and parcel of Jewish history for 2.5 millennia. Likewise, the history of the Americas, both North and South, has been and continues to be constantly formed by immigration, which alters and recasts both the immigrants and the host societies. The 3.5 centuries of Sephardi Mizrahi presence in North America is therefore an important and ongoing part of both histories. Thank you very much.